deposition of Peter Belmont in the matter of Merrill King and Karen King versus St. Petersburg Preservation Incorporated et al. Today's date is December the 13th, 2019. The time is approximately 2:15 p.m. Would counsel please introduce themselves for the record?
Good afternoon. Tyler Hayden, appearing on behalf of the plaintiffs, Merrill and Karen King.
Michael Labby on behalf of the plaintiffs.
Shireen Vesely on behalf of Ann Dowling, Derek Hess, and Allendale Terrace.
Howard Ross on behalf of Preserve the Berg and Peter Belmont.
Court reporter, please swear the witness.
Sir, could you please raise your right hand? You solemnly swear the testimony you'll provide in this cause is the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
It's just a preliminary matter. Please let the record reflect that Emily Elwin is also in the room with us. Sir, can you please state your name for the record?
Peter Belmont.
And have you ever had your deposition taken before?
I have.
Yeah. When was the last time you had your deposition taken?
Earlier today.
So because you had your deposition taken earlier today, I think I'm going to skip over some of the preliminaries. You do understand some of the rules that Mr. Labby went through earlier this morning, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if you could just make audible responses, no head nods, that type of thing, that way we can get a clear record. You understand that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier a little bit about your educational background. I think you said that you had a JD from Florida State?
Correct.
Okay. What was your undergraduate degree in?
Political science?
And do you have any other degrees?
No.
What about certificates?
No.
Real estate license?
No.
So do you have any historical preservation certificates or licenses of any kind?
No.
Have you ever taken any educational seminars or classes on historical preservation?
I have.
Where were those at?
I don't recall what the particular topic was. I believe I attended one once up in Washington. I've attended Preserve the Berg seminars here locally.
When was the first time that you attended a historical seminar or class?
I don't recall.
Was it more than 20 years ago?
If we're counting seminars that were put on by Preserve the Berg, probably.
I'd like to be able to skip over some of these issues too. Earlier this morning when you were testifying as a corporate representative of Preserve the Berg, you testified at length about discovery issues. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you testified about how you searched for emails, text messages, and other documents that were responsive to plaintiff's request for production. Do you remember
Correct.
that? So you do remember that?
Yes.
Without having to go back and rehash all of that, would your responses to that line of questioning regarding discovery and how you search for documents, would that also apply to how you search for emails and text messages that were responsive to plaintiff's request for production that were Peter Belmont's personal text messages and emails?
Yes.
Thank you. I think that cuts off about 30 or 40 minutes. So if I were to ask you that same line of questioning regarding discovery and your personal capacity, your testimony would essentially be the same?
Essentially, yes.
Okay. There's one thing, and if I missed it, I apologize, but do you have a personal computer?
Yes.
Okay. Did you search through that personal computer for responsive emails and text messages?
Yes.
And anything that was searched for and found was ultimately provided to your counsel and then produced?
Provided to counsel and at least in large part, if not totally, produced. I mean, clearly there are communications between myself and counsel that have not been produced.
Of course, and we wouldn't expect to get those. Now, you mentioned that you went to Eckerd College for undergrad, correct?
Correct.
Are you originally from the St. Petersburg area?
No.
Where are you originally from?
New Jersey.
When did you move to the Tampa Bay area?
72.
Would that have been before you attended undergraduate at Eckerd College?
That was for college.
And have you essentially lived within St. Petersburg ever since?
Pretty much.
So it's fair to say that you're pretty familiar with the city of St. Petersburg, having lived here for 40 years?
I think so. I guess it depends in particular what aspect of it, but I think generally.
Are you familiar with the Allendale and Allendale Terrace neighborhoods?
Again, at least generally I am.
How are you familiar with them?
In part by, walking through them, driving through them, bicycling through them. We discussed earlier this morning that I know Ray Arsenault, who lives in the neighborhood, and parts of Allendale, Preserve the Burg has given tours.
So do you personally believe that those neighborhoods contain historic properties?
I do.
And when I say historic properties, I mean not just properties that have been designated as historic, but properties that you personally feel could be designated as historic. Is that true?
Correct. I believe they contain, or they do contain designated properties as well as additional properties that I believe would qualify for designation.
Now, outside of the Doc Webb home, have you ever undertaken or assisted with any historical designations within Allendale or Allendale Terrace?
I have.
Can you elaborate on that? What property it was, that type of thing?
I believe the property was at the corner of MLK, and I think it's 39th. It's 39th or 40th. There were people within the neighborhood who sought designation of that property. It's another example where there was a designation sought by someone other than Preserve the Burg, in which ultimately, after some discussions, there was a compromise reached and owner support for the designation in a manner that was different than the way it was submitted.
I'm just trying to understand then on the corner of 39th and MLK, is that
It's 39th and maybe 40th, like I said.
that Kate Allen, that big stone house that's there?
That describes a number of them, but yes.
Okay, all right. About what year was this that this designation we're talking about?
I'm not sure. It was probably 4 to 5 years ago.
And you mentioned that there was a compromise that was reached, right?
Correct.
Okay. Does that mean that the owner originally opposed designation?
Correct.
And what was the compromise that was reached, if you can recall?
Modified property boundaries for the designation.
Modified how?
The ultimate area that was designated was less than the area that had been proposed in the initial application.
Is that something that the homeowner wanted?
He, as I said, he ultimately agreed to the designation, so he was in support of it at that point.
The portions that weren't designated as historic, was that so that the undesignated portion could be developed?
I don't know in specifically what plans or at the time future plans the owner had for that property.
Do you know if it's since been developed?
It has not.
Do you know if it's developable? Like, could it be developed in the future?
I assume that it could be. Again, it's multiple lots.
So it's a similar situation, I suppose, in some respects to the Doc Webb house in terms of there were several buildable lots. Is that correct?
To the extent that I believe there were multiple lots on the property and that the primary structure did not extend over all those lots. There was a similarity.
I'd like to talk about some of the early years with Preserve the Berg. How was Preserve the Berg founded?
What do you mean?
Was this an idea you came up with because you were interested personally in preservation? I'm just trying to get an idea of who came up with the idea of Preserve the Berg, why it was founded, that type of thing. So I'm going to ask some questions about that, but generally, so you know, that's where I'm going.
Okay. I don't in particular recall whose idea it was. There were a number of individuals who were concerned about aspects of reusing old buildings, in essence, preservation, who decided at some point to organize by creating the organization.
Approximately what year was that?
77.
And who are some of these individuals that you're talking about? And I don't expect you to know, recall all of them, but other than yourself, who else was involved with the founding of Preserve the Berg?
John Warren,
Anyone else?
Howard Hanson,
Anyone else?
I believe Paul and Betty Finley.
Is that Finley?
I believe so.
Anyone other than that?
Not that I presently recall.
So you mentioned Howard Hanson. Does he have a nickname, Howard Furby Hanson? Am I saying that
For the
right?
purpose of what you're asking, it's one and the same person.
Okay, so that's, Howard Hanson is Howard Fenford.
Correct.
So you've known Mr. Hanson since 1977, at least?
Yes.
Okay. Did you know him prior to that?
I don't recall exactly when we met, but it would have been at some point prior to that.
And how did you become acquainted with Mr. Hanson?
I don't recall.
I mean, did you meet him at school, or did you meet him at a bar? I mean,
I
you don't remember?
recall, no.
Okay. Now, in the late 1970s, when you founded Preserve the Berg, were there ordinances within the city of St. Petersburg for historical preservation?
The present preservation ordinance had not been enacted.
When did that come about?
I believe it was around 81.
Did you and Preserve the Berg have any hand in getting the historical designation ordinance passed?
I believe I did.
Can you elaborate on that?
This was at the time when there were proposals to redevelop the Vinoy Hotel. There was litigation involved in some of those issues. I represented a party in that case, and there were, among the discussions in terms of settling that litigation, was starting or creating or enacting an ordinance.
Was the city of St. Petersburg a party of that case?
Yes.
So just so I understand, this is part of some kind of settlement with the city that everyone agreed, let's create a historical designation ordinance? Is that essentially what you're saying?
That's my recollection.
Did you personally have any hand did you personally have a hand in drafting that ordinance?
I did not draft the ordinance.
Did you have suggestions as to how the ordinance should be drafted?
I don't recall today what I made in terms of suggestions.
But that implies that you did have suggestions?
I would imagine I did, but I don't really recall.
Okay, fair enough.
City had retained a consultant.
Was that a consultant from some other city that had a similar ordinance?
I believe that the consultant was actually from the National Trust for Historic Preservation.
So once the historical designation ordinance was passed in the city of St. Petersburg, when was it that Preserve the Burg started working with or focusing on applications to actually designate specific properties in St. Petersburg as historic?
I don't recall in particular, and in part because there was another nonprofit that was doing historic preservation work, and so without kind of going back and reviewing things, I can't say for sure whether it was the St. Petersburg Preservation or one of the other nonprofits.
Do you remember the first property that St. Petersburg Preservation, also known as Preserve the Burg, do you remember the first property that that Preserve the Burg sought to have designated as historic?
I'm probably going to say to you, no, I'm not sure, but I'm going to ask you to, I guess, I'm not sure whether you are asking me, do I recall which property was the first one for which St. Petersburg Preservation submitted an application, or for which St. Petersburg Preservation may have supported an application submitted by another party?
Let's go with the latter, where St. Petersburg Preservation supported an application submitted by another.
And do I remember what the first one was? No.
Okay. What about the first time that Preserve the Burg submitted an application?
I also don't remember what the first one was.
You don't remember the first one?
No.
Okay. Do you remember approximately what year that was? I mean, was it shortly after 81 when the new ordinance gets passed?
Again, I'm going to say to you that I'm not sure in terms of organizations, and so the Roser Park Historic District and the Granada Terrace Historic District were submitted and adopted in the early 80s. I know there was another organization that was involved with Roser Park. St. Petersburg Preservation, I believe, was involved with Granada Terrace and may or may not have been involved with the Roser Park application.
All right. Well, since the early 80s, approximately how many historical designation applications have you or Preserve the Burg either filed or supported? Just ballpark. I'm not expecting you to know the exact number.
I don't really know. I have supported a number of applications. I don't really recall how many that would be.
You think it's more than 50?
I doubt it.
So you think it's more than 40?
Let me also ask for a distinction. When you say support, what do you mean by support? So, for example, do you mean support in the sense that I submitted written or oral comments in support of, or otherwise supported without submitting comments?
Any type of support, whether that's providing comments, written or oral, or just supporting through the filing of an app or through assistance with drafting an application. I don't want to know, like, your personal view as you're sitting on the couch that you wanted something to get designated as historic. I mean that you were actively involved in some kind of capacity.
Okay. It's probably, I would guess it was less than 40.
Okay. it somewhere between 30 and 40?
I could be, I'm not sure.
Is it more than a dozen?
I would imagine so.
Is it more than 2 dozen?
Again, as I've indicated, I don't really recall. It wouldn't surprise me that it's more than 2 dozen, but I'm not really sure.
Okay. Do you know approximately how many times you've appeared in front of City Council on historic designation issues?
No.
Would it be more than 20 times?
Probably.
Same question for the CPPC. How many times have you appeared in front of the CPPC for historical designation issues?
I don't know.
Was it probably more than 20 as well?
Probably. And I assume you include the commission under its previous names and designations?
I'm including that, yes. Is that a yes then?
Yes. Same, I mean, probably.
Probably, okay. So is it fair to say that you've been fairly involved with historical designations of property in St. Petersburg for approximately the last 40 years?
I guess that depends upon one's opinion as to what does it take to be fairly involved, or whatever term you're using.
Okay, in your opinion, have you been fairly involved?
Compared to the average person, yes.
And your involvement, has that only been in the city of St. Petersburg or other jurisdictions and municipalities? And maybe to help, let me clarify. I'm not asking for speaking engagements you've had in other cities. I mean, other applications in other cities or counties. Have you been involved in anything like that, or is this pretty local to St. Petersburg?
As I sit here now, I don't recall where I have been involved with other historic designations from other communities, but it's possible I have been.
So you might have filed an application in another jurisdiction outside of...
I have not filed an application in another jurisdiction. I thought
Okay.
your question was broader than that.
Okay, so let's start very narrow then, and then we can get a little bit broader. So it sounds like you have not filed an application for historic designation in another jurisdiction outside St. Petersburg, right?
Correct, and in terms of when you say, well, that's correct. I've not done so outside of St. Petersburg.
Have you ever provided any assistance in authoring an application outside of St. Petersburg?
No.
Have you ever offered any written or oral support in front of the governing bodies that be regarding an application that had been filed in a particular jurisdiction for historic designation?
Not that I presently recall. It's possible I could have submitted some type of written comment, whether it was a request for comments, for example, from that I received an email from another preservation organization. I don't recall one right now, but I could have.
Outside of quasi-judicial proceedings or other administrative hearings before City Council and the CPPC, how many legal proceedings have you been involved in regarding historical designation in the city of St. Petersburg?
I don't recall.
Have you been involved in any legal proceedings regarding historical designation outside of administrative proceedings with the city?
Yes, I have.
What context would that be in?
The first one that I think of involves the buildings at the 400 block of Central Avenue. There was a judicial proceeding initiated regarding that matter, the litigation. And I will say, well, the litigation was over an issue other than the actual designation, but the topic or ultimate issue involved preservation of the buildings.
Were you an attorney on that case, or?
Yes,
And who did you represent in that case?
preserve the burg.
Do you remember who the other parties were to the case?
City of St. Petersburg. I believe there was an additional party. I'd have to go back and confirm they were actually a party.
Was it a developer?
Property owner.
Do you remember approximately what year that was?
I think it was about, again, 4 to 5 years ago.
Just trying to understand the type of the proceeding too. Was this like an appellate proceeding from a city council ruling, or was this an original action?
It was a cert action.
And those cert actions seem to happen from time to time after city council has a decision that's made at a quasi-judicial ruling. Is that right?
I'm not sure what your question is.
When city council makes a ruling as to whether or not a property should be designated as historic or not, if one party or the other is not happy with that ruling that city council has made, typically they file an appeal, a cert action. Is that right?
Well, I wouldn't say they typically file an appeal. I guess my answer would be that one way for a party to seek review of the city council decision would typically be by cert.
And what I'm trying to understand, just so you know where I'm going, is just how many of those cert actions have you been involved with, either as an attorney or as a client or in your capacity as a representative of Preserve the Burg?
And I guess the question I have to clarify your question is, are you asking me how many times I have been involved in the capacity you described in seeking review of a historic designation
Either
issue?
seeking review or defending somebody else that's seeking review.
I'd have to probably go back and review records, so my answer is I'm not sure. And I'm not sure that I've actually been involved in any cert action that has sought review of a designation decision.
Does that mean that you have been involved with some that you were in a defensive posture?
No, as I think I at least indicated, the one example that, or matter that we have discussed, which was involving buildings on the 400 block, was not an action over the designation decision.
What was that action regarding then?
The city's decision to grant an exemption to the conditions that would normally be required before a demolition permit could be issued.
Do you remember what those conditions were? Or the exemptions to the conditions?
There are several exemptions provided for in the ordinance, so that's whatever exemptions there are set forth in the ordinance.
You know which ordinance that is?
It's under the DC zoning district ordinance.
Do you know the ordinance number?
No.
I'd like to change topics and talk about some more specifics with this case. Are you familiar with Doc Webb?
Could you be more specific?
Who is Doc Webb?
Doc Webb is known for his drugstore.
And what was this drugstore?
It was a large commercial establishment in St. Petersburg.
Was Doc Webb's drugstore still in St. Petersburg and still operating when you were living here?
Yes.
Did you visit that store?
Yes.
What were your impressions of that store?
I don't particularly recall, other than it was a large building.
So you don't remember any of the chickens or any of the other stuff that is kind of legendary from the Doc Webb store?
I have a hard time distinguishing my own personal experience with it as compared to reading stories and newspaper articles and information about them.
Fair enough. Would you personally consider Doc Webb important to the history of St. Petersburg?
Yes.
And is that based on the drugstore or something else?
Based on the drugstore.
Now, other than visiting the drugstore yourself personally, do you have any other personal connection to Doc Webb?
There's a smile again. I'm not sure what you mean. I've been to the play about Doc Webb. I don't know if you consider that a personal
Yeah, no,
connection.
I just mean you weren't friends with him. You're not buddies. You're not playing cards or anything, right?
Correct.
And he's not your uncle or cousin or.
Correct.
Okay. Now, other than the house formerly owned by the plaintiffs, in this case the Kings, and we'll call that the Doc Webb house, and you know what I mean if I call it the Doc Webb house, right?
Yes.
So other than the Doc Webb house, are you familiar with any other properties within St. Petersburg that Doc Webb was associated with?
Again, I don't know what you mean by familiar.
Do you know if Doc Webb owned any other residences in the city of St. Petersburg where he lived?
From reading information, my understanding is that he did own other properties.
And that's in addition to the commercial drugstore that he owned, right?
Correct.
Were there multiple locations for that drugstore?
I don't know. I'm familiar with the location it had in the blocks near what we today call MLK and First Avenues.
Do you remember what year the Doc Webb drugstore was closed?
No.
Do you remember if there was a big going out of business sale or any kind of pomp and circumstance that surrounded the closing of the Doc Webb store?
I don't particularly recall.
I'd like to talk about some other individuals that are involved in this case. Ann Dowling. When did you first meet Ann Dowling?
I'm not really sure when I first met Ann. I don't consider her I think in response to discovery, we indicated that she's an acquaintance of mine, so I don't really recall when we first met.
Do you recall the circumstances in which you met?
No.
Did you know that Miss Dowling was an attorney when you first met her?
I don't know.
Do you know that now?
Yes.
Did Miss Dowling ever seek legal advice from you?
She asked me to represent her
In what capacity?
as an attorney.
In relation to what case or set of facts?
I believe she wanted representation in the matter that's been referred to as the Terrellon property. I think there may be a message somewhere in the doc web stuff about her wanting me to represent her.
The Terrellon matter, is that the 810 35th Avenue, I think?
Correct.
So she sought legal advice from you regarding the potential historic designation of the property at 810 35th Avenue North?
Well, I said she wanted me to represent her. I did not give her legal advice.
She sought it and you said no?
Well, there's also, I think, a difference between asking or seeking legal advice and seeking to be represented, but the answer is no.
Okay. Did you represent her in any capacity regarding that historical designation?
No.
Did you provide her with advice generally as to historical preservation related to the 810 35th Avenue North property?
No.
So you didn't explain to her where she could find an application, for example, or how the city operates, nothing like that?
Nothing like that.
Now, when she asked you for advice, or whether that was legal or otherwise, was that in person or was that a phone call?
And I'm going to ask you to be more specific.
Okay, bad question. Let me just re-ask it this way. When she sought your advice, whether it was legal or otherwise, regarding a potential historic designation of 810 35th Avenue North, was that through a phone call?
Same objection.
And I'm going to, again, say that, as I explained to you, I think asking me to represent, her asking me to represent her and her asking me for legal advice are not necessarily the same thing. I view them as two different things. I said that she asked me to represent her. How she asked me to represent her, I believe it was in a phone call. I'm not positive.
Why didn't you want to represent Mrs. Dowling in that matter?
As I indicated to you, I was retired, so I was not seeking clients.
What about Derek Hess? Do you know Dr. Hess?
No,
You don't know him?
no.
Have you ever met him?
I don't believe so. I mean, it's possible we could have been at something together, but I don't recall meeting him.
What about Emily Elwin? When did you first meet Miss Elwin?
I don't recall.
Was it last year or was it 20 years ago?
Neither.
Was it more than a year ago?
Yes,
Okay. Was it more than 5 years ago?
I believe so.
Was it more than 10 years ago?
I don't think so. Emily moved here probably sometime 10 or a little less years ago, so I'm not sure.
Do you remember the circumstances of how you met?
I don't.
Do you remember how it came to be that she was involved with Preserve the Bird?
No, I don't.
What's the nature of your relationship with Miss Elwin?
She's a friend of mine, and obviously we are fellow board members with Preserve the Bird.
Now, what about the Kings? You know, excluding having now you know who they are, and you saw them at city council hearing. Have you ever met them prior to any of this litigation?
Not to my knowledge.
Had you ever heard of the Kings prior to this litigation?
I don't recall in the email, essentially no, I don't recall whether or not in the email that we made reference to earlier this morning, whether their name was mentioned as being the owners, so.
Okay. But other than that, I mean, no one, 20 years ago, someone didn't come to you and say, hey, the Kings are the ones that own the Dock Web House.
Not that I know of.
Okay. Do you recall when you first noticed the Dock Web House or knew of its existence?
No.
What about Allendale Terrace Neighbors United, Inc.? Are you familiar with that entity?
I guess, again, I'm going to say in part, what do you mean by that? I clearly understand that they have been involved in this matter. I don't feel I know anything about them.
When was the first time you heard of that entity?
Probably when I saw the application.
And generally, do you understand that entity to be a organization that was created by Ann Dowling?
I don't really know.
Did you ever speak with Ann Dowling about forming a neighborhood entity to represent Allendale?
Not that I recall.
Now, we talked a little bit this morning about an application that was filed to designate the King's Home as historic. So if I use the word application, you understand what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Now that application, when did you first see it?
I believe when Laura Duvico emailed it to me.
Do you believe that email is within the production that was provided by your counsel?
Yes.
When did you first realize that that application was not on a City of St. Petersburg form, but was on a Pinellas County form?
Back to the form of the question.
And I guess, as I think we're all aware, is it seems to be a combination of forms, so there is at least a portion of it which is on a City of St. Petersburg form that I recall.
Yeah, I believe the first page is, but some of the other pages after that might be a county application form. We can agree on that, right?
Yes.
And my question's simple. When did you first notice that there were county pages intermixed within the application?
I don't recall when I first looked at the application, so again, as reflected in the emails, I believe I received the application from Laura Duvico. I believe I had forwarded that application to Howard Hansen, after receiving it, and I think I noted, if I recall correctly, that I hadn't even looked at the application when I had sent it to him, so I don't recall the date when I first looked at the application. Again, the application speaks for itself. It shows part of it is on a county form.
Excuse me.
I'd like to move on and talk about the purchase offer that Ann Dowling ultimately made to the Kings regarding the purchase of their home. If I say that, do you understand what I mean?
Well, I'm not sure, so my question is, do you mean the letter, what has been identified as the letter of intent?
Yes.
All right.
And I think we can agree that letter was dated, I believe, February 21st of
That
2019.
sounds about right, at least.
Okay. All right. So prior to February 21st of 2019, did Ann ever tell you she was interested in purchasing the King's property?
Yes.
Do you remember approximately when she told you that?
I don't. I don't remember the date when she first told me that.
Do you recall if it was before December 31st, 2018, or was it into the new year?
I believe it was in the new year. I had very little contact, to my recollection, with Ann regarding the property in 2018.
There were some phone calls between you and the city of St. Petersburg and Mr. Kramer towards the end of 2018, though, right?
Yes.
And some of that was regarding a potential sale of the King's property to someone other than David Weekley Homes, correct?
I would describe the call, and I'd have to go back and check dates. I believe there was one call in December of 2018 that involved Mr. Kramer, myself, and the city of St. Petersburg. And I would describe the reason for that call as being to discuss whether or not some type of compromise might be achievable.
You mentioned the city of St. Petersburg was on that call. Was that Michael Dima? Was that who was on the call?
I want to say that Mr. Dima was not. I'd have to perhaps review something to confirm that. My recollection is that from the city of St. Petersburg were Derek Kilborn and Laura Duvico.
And that phone call that you had with the city and Jake Kramer at the end of 2018, is that's not the first time that you had spoken with Laura Duvicott or Derek Kilborn, right?
About anything?
About historic designation in the city of St. Petersburg.
For any property.
For any property, yeah.
Correct.
Because you're familiar with them outside of this King litigation and the Doc Webb issue, correct?
Correct.
I'm handing you 2 pages that I've marked as Exhibit 1. And for the record, Exhibit 1 is PB PTB 00041 and 42. If you could take a look at that document and then let me know when you're done reviewing.
Go ahead.
Okay. Do you recognize this document?
I recognize it as one of the documents that we provided to you, yes.
Okay. And what I'm trying to understand here is, these are text messages, right?
Correct.
And I'm trying to understand, it says to Peter Belmont at the top. You see that?
Yes.
Okay, and it's the first text message that appears is November 11th, 2018 at 3:57 p.m. You see that?
Yes.
Okay, what I'm trying to understand is who the other party to this conversation is. Do you recall having looked at this?
I believe it is Emily Elwin.
And looking at the text messages, as you are what appears to be the recipient of these texts, right? It says to Peter Belmont at the top. And I'm not trying to hide the ball. What I'm trying to figure out is who's who in this conversation.
The first text message has Ann Dowling, etc. That is me.
Okay. So let's take a look at that first text message. Can you read that whole text for us?
Has Ann Dowling contacted you about Doc Webb home landmark application? I've had a call from Jim Stitt with Allendale Neighborhood about it and us helping.
Now, us helping, is that in reference to you and Emily personally or as representatives of Preserve the Burg? Meaning, was Jim Stitt reaching out to you and Emily personally or in your capacity as representatives of Preserve the Burg?
I guess my response is you'd have to ask Jim Stitt.
Okay.
And I don't recall whether Jim if Jim asked, which is why I'm saying you need to ask Jim Stitt. I don't recall whether Jim asked me and didn't mention Emily and did not mention Preserve the Burg, or if he mentioned Emily and or mentioned Preserve the Burg. So to the extent it says us, that may have been my adding that in and not what Jim himself said.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Do you see Miss Elwin's response there on the right? She says, she did she submit, she is determined, but I told her she needs to be sure she has neighborhood support. I don't like third party on individual residential properties. You see where I'm reading?
Yes.
And then she finishes, worries me, it will hurt in the long run. Do you agree with that statement? In terms of, do you like third-party designations for individual residential properties?
I don't know what you mean by like.
Do you agree with third-party historical designation within the city of St. Petersburg?
I think there's a role for third-party designations
What would that role be?
to allow for designation of properties where the property owner is not undertaking the application.
And do you agree with that even when an owner is opposed to third-party designation?
I have the same answer. I believe that there is a role for that.
So you would support designation even if a homeowner is opposed to it?
I could, yes.
What about that last sentence? Worries me it will hurt in the long run. What do you think Ms. Elwin meant by that?
And I'm going to respond by saying, you know, if you want to know what she meant by it, you need to ask Emily. I can say, based upon conversations I've had with Emily in the past, I believe what she was saying is that that third-party owner-objected applications have been, to some degree, controversial in front of City Council, and so there is a concern that if too many owner-objected applications appear in front of city council, that city council will disfavor them.
Disfavor them as in just voting against them individually, or do you think that the city might completely abolish third-party designation applications?
Could be either.
And that's something that you personally would not like to see, right?
As I said, I think there's a role for third-party applications.
I'd like to look at the bottom of page 1 here. See how after the last text message here, there's a date, 11/12/18 at 7:06 p.m., but then there's no text message?
Correct.
And then moving on to PB, PTB 42, you'd agree with me that that's the next bait stamp within the range of the production that you provided?
Correct.
Okay. And my question to you is, do you know if there's another text message that follows in this chain in your conversation with Ms. Elwin between November 11th and November 12th of 2018?
I'm going to respond by saying, without going back and looking, that I believe that there was nothing else that was responsive to your request. So what I mean by that is that whatever follow-up there may have been, I don't believe was responsive to the message that we're looking at. It was not about the web application. So there have certainly been times when Emily and I have gone back and forth in a series of text messages on multiple subjects.
Okay, so essentially is it what you're saying that this text message on 11/12/18 at 7:06 p.m., you're saying that that basically was not responsive to plaintiff's request for production, and that's why it is not included within this text thread?
Yes, again, I'm saying that to the extent that there's a date below the final message and there does not appear to be a, if you want to say, a text attached to that, my answer is yes.
And if that text was responsive, that's something that you could go back and look at and provide ultimately if it was responsive? Meaning you haven't deleted the text?
I don't recall whether you got both sides of these text messages or not, meaning both the copy from my side of the text messaging and the copy from Emily's side. So my understanding is Emily has not deleted anything. And I can also say that, as I said, we searched through documents, I believe, as requested, and provided documents as requested, and we're not providing documents that were not relevant to the request, so.
All right, looking a little bit at the substance of these texts, the last one that appears on PB, PTB 41, and it starts with, wasn't it just bought by David Weekley? And I think what you're referring to there is the King's Home, right?
Correct.
And it says, wasn't it just bought by David Weekley Home, so not quite same as individual home application? Did I read that right?
Yes.
Okay, and that's a text message from you to Miss Elwin, right?
Correct.
And what do you mean by it's not quite the same as individual home application?
I viewed the situation where the property was changing owners to be different than where there was a residential property that was under ongoing ownership without a change of ownership.
And how is that different?
That's just my perspective, so for the purpose of application of the ordinance, I don't think it is different.
From your personal perspective, then, what's the distinction?
The distinction is that that there is going to be a new owner, and so there's an opportunity to make that new owner, if you want to say, aware of the historical significance of the property, and why I said, wasn't it just bought by David Weekley, as far as where that was in the transaction, I was not sure at that point. And so the application having been submitted potentially would allow the new owner to understand that there was a potential designation that would come with the property, which I think is different than where there is an ongoing ownership and an application is submitted.
Okay, and what I'm trying to drill down into is specifics as to how that's different. Are you saying that because the property is changing hands at that time, that it would be an opportune time to perhaps designate the property as historic? Is that what you mean by a difference?
That, again, that potentially before the ownership change occurs, that appeared likely to happen, that the designation issue could be addressed by all parties involved, and that is a little different in my mind than where someone has had a property for a long time and again is not putting the market up for sale and intending to no longer own it. So in essence, the one owner is no longer going to be an owner, and so it's a little different. Their opinion is not so much as the property owner once it changes hands as they're another party. So that's in essence my view of why it's a little different.
So basically the property owner that's selling the property might not be as opposed because they're just trying to walk away from it and move on.
Well, I guess from my perspective, potentially would have a lesser interest, and there's a different person who's going to have a greater interest, this new prospective owner.
So is it fair to say that during this transition in ownership, it's a good time to work out a deal, so to speak, in terms of designating a property as historic?
No objection.
It could be. Again, it depends upon the parties involved in the situation.
In your experience, has that been an opportune time to designate a property as historic when there's a change in ownership?
The best way I think I can answer that is that another instance that comes to my mind involved the North Ward Elementary School, and again it was undergoing a change in ownership, and so it seemed like an opportunity to discuss the future use and designation of the property.
We talked a little bit earlier about a Kate Allen property that was on the corner of MLK, where you would help facilitate a compromise with the property owner as to historical designation. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Is that a circumstance where that property was being sold and during that transition in ownership there was an agreement reached as to designating at least a portion of the property as historic?
No, there was not a change in ownership going on.
Okay. So different from the circumstance with the Kings,
Yes.
in that respect at least.
Yes.
I'm going to hand you what I'm marking as Exhibit 2. Sorry. And for the record, Exhibit 2 is Bait Stamps PB PTB 00061. Mr. Belmont, have you had a time to review this document?
Yes.
Okay, and you recognize it?
Yes.
And I'm not going to focus on the top of the email about the wildly inaccurate, incomplete issue that I think was belabored earlier today, but I'd like to talk about the last portion of this email below. And this is an email, I believe, Thursday, November 15th, 2018 at 4:19 p.m. And it says, Peter Belmont wrote, do you see where I'm at?
Yes.
And at the bottom, last paragraph, it says, can you read that for me? It's starting with Ray, comma.
Ray, if you're able to touch base with owner, you can also explain that we would like to talk to him about the application process and benefits if he's willing to do so. What is the best way to reach him?
So is that we're talking about Ray Arsenal, right?
Correct.
Okay. And that's you writing to Ray?
He's copied on it, yes.
Okay. Do you know if Ray actually did this, what you're directing him to do here?
My understanding is he did not end up speaking with the Kings.
Do you know if he attempted to?
I'm not positive. I know Ray at the time was going out of town a short time thereafter, and so I am not sure if he actually attempted to do so before he went out of town or not.
Is this something that you or someone from Preserve the Burg normally does when there's a third-party designation application filed against their property?
What do you mean in terms of normally do what?
Normally reach out to the property owner to exactly what you said here. Reach out to him about the application process and benefits, and if he's willing to do so, what is the best way to reach him?
If Preserve the Burg is going to file an application, we will try to reach out to the property owner.
If Preserve the Burg doesn't file an application but subsequently supports an application that's filed by somebody else, is it something that Preserve the Burg normally does to reach out to that property owner regarding the third-party designation application process?
We would have hoped that the applicant had already done so.
In the event the applicant hasn't done so, is it something that Preserve the Burg would normally do in terms of reaching out to that owner of the third party, the owner of the property who recently had a third-party designation application filed against him or her?
That in part at least is the message that you see. So to the extent that Ray lived in the neighborhood, had met the Kings before, there appeared to be a lack of communications between Ann Dowling and the Kings that this request was made of Ray.
What else does Preserve the Burg do when it wishes to support a local historic designation application that's been filed by a third party
Again,
in terms of outreach to the property owner?
it depends upon the circumstances of the situation, so I don't think there is, again...
There's no set playbook?
Well, no, there's no set playbook, and no set playbook. I'll leave it at that.
What are items that have been done in the past to reach out to owners of property that have recently had a third-party designation application filed against his or her property?
Again, you're asking for myself or for Preserve the Burg?
For both.
Phone calls would be another example. So in essence, I'm going to say the typical ways one could potentially communicate with another party, in person, telephone call, email.
And the goal of that communication is what?
Again, it depends upon the circumstance, but ultimately the goal would be to see if there can be an agreement reached upon how to proceed.
Is there any educational aspect to that communication that you or Preserve the Burg is trying to confer as well?
again, that depends upon the circumstance and what the individual's knowledge may be regarding the application and what's involved with designation. And to what extent any discussion is desired.
And I think you testified a moment ago that Ray wasn't able to touch base with the Kings.
I said I don't believe so. I think that's what I said.
Yeah, I don't recall. Do you know if that's because Ray just didn't have the chance, or that the Kings didn't return his calls or his emails? Do you remember?
I'm not positive. I believe, as I indicated, that Ray was going to be going out of town and was going to try to communicate with them before he went out of town. So I am not really sure whether then he was unsuccessful because he tried and did not reach them, or because he did not actually have an opportunity to do so before he left.
Why is it that you chose Ray to reach out to the Kings? Is it because he lived in the neighborhood?
He lived in the neighborhood and had met the Kings on previous occasions.
And also because he wasn't the one that actually filed the application? Is that a reason as well?
I don't think I really considered that. Ray's a board member, Ray's a neighbor, Ray had met the Kings before. Ray indicated he would be willing to reach out to them.
Handing you what I've marked as Exhibit 3. And for the record, Exhibit 3 is PB PTB 00056. Mr. Belmont, do you recognize this document?
Yes.
I'd like to focus here in the middle of the page. It says on Sunday, November 11th, 2018 at 4 p.m., Peter Belmont wrote. Do you see where that is?
Yes.
And in this, you start with, I've had a call from an Allendale neighborhood person about landmark application filed for the property and wanting to know if we could help supplement application. Do you see what I'm reading?
Yes.
Okay. And after that, you write, another can't win application. What did you mean by that, can't win?
That it was a third-party owner-objected application, which, as I'd indicated earlier, are controversial with council. Council seems to generally be reluctant to designate over owner objection.
Any other reason that you describe the application as can't win?
No.
So when you say can't win, you're strictly referring to the fact that it was a third-party application, and those typically are not successful in front of City Council?
Third-party owner objected.
So there's no other reason that you describe it as can't win other than that?
I guess a subset of that would be that in addition to being the third-party owner objected application, it was residential property, and I felt that would be another factor that would make it difficult for council to approve of designation over owner objection.
Any other reasons that the application was a can't win application?
I don't believe so.
Handing you what I've marked as Exhibit 4. And for the record, Exhibit 4 is PB/PTB 00059. Mr. Belmont, do you recognize this document?
Yes.
What is this document?
It's an email from me to Ann Dowling,
Is there anyone else copied on the email?
as indicated in the message heading, Emily Elwin.
And what's the date of this email?
Again, the message head indicates December 18th.
2018 at 5:35 p.m. Is that accurate?
That's what it says, yes.
Okay. And it starts with, and this is you writing to Miss Dowling, right?
Correct.
And it starts with, Ann, I have reached out to the attorney who is representing the Kings. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And when you say the attorney who is representing the Kings, who are you referring to?
Jake Kramer.
Do you remember when you reached out to Jake Kramer?
Not without checking. I believe it is within a day or two of this message.
And I think you testified earlier during the corporate representative deposition that that was via phone call.
Correct.
How did-
And again, there's emails. There's an email back from Jake subsequent to that phone call that's been produced that says, thanks for talking, or something to that effect yesterday. So again, that would identify the date.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to figure out is just a timeline, a couple simple things. Was that the first time you had reached out to Jake Kramer?
Yes.
So you think it was a day or two before December 18th, 2018?
That's what I believe right now. Again, as I indicated, I think there's ways that are probably pretty easy to figure out when that phone call was.
Why did you reach out to Mr. Kramer?
To see if there was the possibility of reaching a compromise that would result in a consensus among, including the property owners, of supporting an application.
And I understand that that was probably the desired goal of the phone call, or at least the initial contact with Mr. Kramer, but what I'm trying to figure out is, did you reach out to Mr. Kramer under your own volition, or did someone ask you to contact him? What was the impetus for making that phone call?
Yes, I reached out to Mr. Kramer, and in combination with the goal of attempting to reach a compromise that could be supported by the property owner, was the concern as well that absent a consensus being reached and it being a third-party owner-objected application, that council would deny it.
Had you
I had not spoken to Ann Dowling before reaching out to Mr. Kramer.
You stole my next question. Yeah, just let me finish with this document. We can go. So you said you hadn't spoken with Ann Dowling prior to reaching out to Jake Kramer. Is that correct? Okay. So up until that point, you had just been speaking internally with those from Preserve the Burg regarding the filing of that application. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Anyone else that you were speaking with?
Well, I think we have discussed that Jim Stitt had reached out to me about an application being filed. So if you consider that a discussion, there was that.
Okay, and I'm trying to. Jim Stitt wasn't a member of Preserve the Burg?
He was a member. He was not on the board.
Okay.
Well, actually, to go back, I'd have to double check. I believe he has been a member, but he may not have been a member at that time.
But he reached out to you in his capacity as, I think he was part of the Neighborhood Crime Watch or something along those lines? Does that sound right?
Again, you're kind of, you'd have to ask Jim why he decided to reach out to me. We've had, contact. Mr. Stitt and myself have had contact with one another in the past.
So was it your idea to reach out to Jake Kramer?
I believe so. I mean, in terms of, did somebody ask me to reach out to Jake? No.
right, I think we could take a break now.
Going off the record, the time is 3:35 p.m.